Last episode, I ended off talking about Reiner's motivational speech to Eren, which may not have been the best idea on his part, inspiring an already ferocious guy who was on the enemy side. Hello listeners, and welcome to A Dash of Salt with AJ. I'm your host, Ahsoka Jackson. Okay, y'all know how much I love Eren, and I could talk about him all day, let's be real. But I'm gonna try not to get too sidetracked with that in this podcast, because this is our time in Marley now, and we're really getting insight into our characters from this side. Returning to Reiner, there's this repeated theme we've seen of him reaching out to others, both literally and figuratively. And there's this theme of loss and abandonment that's been tied to Reiner's character since the beginning, in several senses. I realized that the first words of this episode were, "We were abandoned. That's why we lived in a camp surrounded by walls." His mother said that while tucking him in. And then we have his father, who rather literally rejected him and ran away. And we have Marley and society as a whole and how it treats the audience. There's also that realization Reiner had of how even his becoming an elite, becoming a warrior, wasn't good enough to make a difference to his jerk father. Ouch. And before he was chosen, the scenario was that there was a group of 7 candidates and 6 were going to be chosen. So one person there was going to be left in the dust. And Gander definitely suggested that Reiner was getting the lowest scores or had no particular areas of strength to vouch for. Heck, when they were ultimately selected, the big thing pointed out about Reiner was ultimately his perseverance, which is valuable, and I see a parallel to Eren there. From what I understand, he was basically pretty average in both the physical and academic areas of training. Nothing inherently special or noteworthy. But what made the key difference is that he had this ferocious tenacity to him. His perseverance and work ethic were what made it, and how he was able to ultimately not only pass, but excel. He ended up in the top 10, and actually the top 5 as well. It's also mentioned in the manga at one point that he was at the top of the class when it came to hand-to-hand combat, other than Mikasa. But it shows his improvement there, especially after Annie had trained him. That clearly paid off, and we got to see him use those skills against Jean a tiny bit, and more importantly, against Reiner and even Annie herself when they were each in Titan form. So while I do figure he ultimately had a knack for that, there's something to be said for the sheer grit it took to get there. And yes, as another commenter pointed out, Reiner even recognized that aspect of himself in Eren during training, and he sort of picked Eren up the way that Bertolt had picked him up. I hadn't even been expecting those flashbacks, by the way. When we were seeing young Reiner's ferocity and his determination to reach his goal, and we heard those fiery words from him, I was mentally trying to compare and contrast that with Eren's words and what motivates him. Like, the whole heroism or esteem thing isn't really him, I'd say. But I wasn't expecting them to suddenly just cut over to parties like that. Tiny Eren just chilling there, saying he wished something would happen. Dang. Famous last words, little boy. And Armin... Oh, and I swear that smiling Titan, aka Dina Fritz Jaeger, just seems to get creepier with every new appearance. First time we saw it in the first 3 seasons, it was creepy as fudge. And when they showed it again, it just seemed like it had gotten even more creepy. And now Mappa has gotten a hold of it, and... Yep. By the way, I feel like her little backstory is pretty much emblematic of Attack on Titan in a couple of ways. She gave birth to a son of royal blood, and the Restorationists pinned their hopes on him, and whoops. And then that tearful, sort of tragic romance moment where she promised to find Grisha again. Yeah, she found where he lived and killed his second wife. Attack on Titan, baby, where hope goes to die. I immediately joked when I saw the title of this episode, The Door of Hope. There are flickers of hope in this show, but for the most part, yeah. I already summarized how it goes in my first trailer reaction episode. Isayama gives with one hand, and takes with the other, and then borrows an assistant's hand so he can take some more. But returning to those themes of loss and abandonment, we also have what happens with Marcel. He did sacrifice himself to save Reiner, so it's different from voluntary departure, but it's still a loss. And evidently, Marcel was not only a member, but also the leader for their team. Which also helps explain why Reiner ended up having to improvise as much as he did, I suppose. And then, of course, we know that they lost Annie at the end of Season 1, so that sure didn't end well. And then he finally lost Bertolt, permanently, at the end of Season 3. And at least there's a faint hope of possible recovery, since it at least seems they can't actually kill her or do anything to her, but she's still a prisoner at last check, being kept in an unknown location. No longer an active team member, that's for sure. And there was that scene from the harbor last week that folks mentioned, when Reiner had that flashback and was basically pleading with them not to leave him behind again. And of course, he also had that situation as a double agent who basically became consumed by the mission. And he had to be the one then to abandon his former comrades. And of course, that bond was severed by his betrayal. So again, he was largely left alone, and this time he was in the position of doing the abandoning. They turned their backs on him only after he did so to them. So that probably did bother him extra, being the sort of person who abandoned and betrayed folks, and caused the same sort of pain that he had been on the receiving end of himself. And you know that Eren took that especially hard. Eren never once believed that Annie or Reiner and Bertolt were traitors. And he'd bonded with them over the shared experiences and insights he believed them to have. And even where he'd disagreed or taken on a different course or perspective, he'd still had respect for them and loyalty to them as comrades and friends. Up until they just stuck their blades into his gut. Oh, speaking of experiences, I meant to say earlier that I'd really wondered before how much training and experience the team had been able to have as Titans, especially since they obviously were adept already at using their powers by the time we met them in the first season. That sequence also gave us a glimpse of how Marley has been operating all this time. Based on stuff in the anime itself and the corresponding manga chapters, they basically created this vicious cycle where there's continual warfare, and their own actions just breed further hostility towards themselves and towards the Eldians, who serve as some of their most effective and terrifying weapons. And it seems a lot of this is in the name of status and resources, ultimately. If that behavior is quote-unquote necessary for them to survive, which I kind of doubt it anyways, it would still be a necessity of their own making. Oh, I just realized that maybe the reason the guy just said that Bertolt could handle it, it may be that it takes a certain sort of stability or even restraint to wield that power, and Bertolt had a calm and steady enough disposition for that. But anyways, it was striking to see how they were going to war, just hardcore, and at those ages. And of course, we've already seen some of that in the first episode of this season. Parties sends kids off to fight, but they basically go into the training at 12 and then graduate at 15. Marley has Eldian children off on the hardcore battlefield at 12. Also, I've seen folks complain about this and call it stupid and immersion breaking, but I don't think that's the case at all. Child soldiers have very much been a thing in real life, and not just in old times. And I don't find it that far-fetched in context. I'm guessing Marley probably starts them off so young to try and make sure they're easy to control and influence and thoroughly compliant by the time they get the powers and throughout their use of the powers. It takes them during the molding years. Plus, Marley doesn't give a fudge about their well-being to begin with. And with Paradis, they don't go so far, but with humanity on its last legs, an accelerated schedule of having them go into training at 12 and full service at 15 doesn't seem that far-fetched, all things considered. Alright guys, thanks for hanging with me today. Next episode we'll be discussing the gun scene, as well as a certain dark, maybe even slightly sinister pattern we see with Reiner. Obviously, the episode is going to contain discussions of suicide, and it will probably get fairly graphic, so if that's an issue for you, please be advised. I will see if I can provide a timestamp so that you can still enjoy the other sections of the episode, even if you need to avoid that one. In the meantime, if you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to subscribe for updates and leave a like, share, or review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Spotify, social media, or whichever platform you use to listen. Be blessed and stay salty.